Today is Jacqui van Twest. Jacqui is from
Australia,
where in Australia?
Brisbane.
Brisbane, way down south by Hobart.
No, it's up north. It's in Queensland, east coast, about
Mhm.
midway up.
And did you hear how she made no into noi? It's so good. God, it's great to hear that. You get to talk with us about your time at NASA and working on the life sciences there. Where are you now?
I'm at UW-Madison in the biochemistry department,
Working on what?
cryo-electron microscopy. There's a facility there with some cutting edge technology, and I'm supporting those groups now.
Excellent. So we'll try this. I'm hoping that it looks all right on for at least the folks on the Zoom and YouTube. I apologize again to the folks that are here. Would you please join me in welcoming Jacqui to Play-Doh?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone. Well, as Tom said, I used to work at NASA. I worked there for about 20 years in different locations. And today I thought I would share some of my experiences that I had at NASA and show you what different things that I did there over the next year. So as you all know, this image on this blue ball, the marble, is iconic image. It was taken by the Apollo astronauts, and that was really had a huge impact on humanity. Because for the first time, they saw the planet as a ball, as a sphere. So that's brought to humanity a different perspective. So this slide, I just wanted to, remind everyone that NASA is a federal agency and it was developed in the 50s. And as such, they have centers all over America. And each center is kind of structured to provide a different support role to the many different objectives that NASA undertakes. For me, I was, as Tom mentioned, in life sciences. And so I primarily worked at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And that center is responsible for launch and landing. And then also at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Up here in the top right is a picture of the 2 launch pads that were used for the shuttle program. That's 39A and B. And those are currently being used today too for the SpaceX launches, and also Artemis 1 in the future will be launching from those launch pads at Kennedy Space Center. The bottom picture, Dryden Flight Research Center, is another facility that is out in California. And as the team that were involved with all the launch and landings, we also had to set up and have prepared facilities at Dryden because it was the alternate or backup landing site for all the shuttle missions. So often, as you all are probably aware, that during the shuttle mission, shuttle program, that was a very delicate instrument, and certain parameters for launch and landing had to be within certain windows. So if those windows were not achievable because of weather or other things, then we would land in California. And this actually happened quite a lot. So we would have, for us in life sciences, we had a whole facility that was prepared and ready to capture any of the science that came off the space shuttle. So we had laboratories there with a second team of scientists who were ready to do any post-flight data processing on those. We also have what I'll talk about later, which is the human life sciences teams that were looking at the physiological changes to the astronauts. And they try to capture that and have as little time between when they land and when those experiments start, so that because the body quickly adapts and they want to try and capture any changes as quickly as possible and then monitor them thereafter. So we were responsible for those 2 locations. And then, of course, that picture in the middle where you've got the shuttle piggybacking home from California. to Florida, where it would be refurbished for the next shuttle mission. And everyone knows that bottom picture, mission control in Houston. That's where we would communicate with shuttle teams, space station teams, as they're up there working on experiments. And so the science team have their own like mission control, which is where we are based with our teams to support any questions that come up real time during the mission. I have this slide, it's an old slide, but I feel like it's a really good one because it just highlights all the spin-offs and all the things that humanity, gets from doing something hard, like going into space, like stretching ourselves by developing new technologies, new materials, and other things like that, that help us every day in things that we do. If you think about how much life has changed in the past, 20, 30 years, or even, 50 years since the moon missions, there's been a lot of improvements and changes. Some might call upgrades, others might not like them so much, but a lot of those things, technologies have come out of the space industry. equipment that go to the moon and Mars missions, or the satellites that go out into the solar system. We would be responsible for making sure that the vehicles were void of any life forms. So basically doing, microbial tests on the vehicles that were being assembled at Kennedy before they were put onto one of the rockets. So this was a great experience. I got to be like an internal science advocate for many of the teams from all over the world. And that was really important role because within NASA, it's primarily a lot of engineers, which makes sense, and management teams. And so we were kind of the voice for those teams because we understood a bit more in a detailed way what was required to make the science successful. Because the teams couldn't, come and stay at Kennedy, for all of the simulations that we would run, or for, pre-flight, they might only be able to come for certain points, and then we would support during the other times when they went home to take care of their other projects. So Kennedy was a lot of that type of support of different projects, but also there was a big component of that baseline data collection for the human astronauts. And so we have a facility at Kennedy Space Center that is in the, as you know, NASA loves acronyms. So it's in the ONC building, which is the Operations and Checkout building. That's, about half an hour from the landing strip, and they devise a special and where we collect the astronauts off the space station, off the shuttle, and then rooms over to the DCF and start doing science on them. And it was a vestibular function test. It looked at cardiac volume and muscle strength, and there's just a range of various experiments that they were looking at to see what of the physiology had changed in the astronauts and how fast was it adapting back to climbing. So after that, I decided I wanted to consider for basic research and more human focused jobs in Space Center is where the astronauts and train. So I decided that was a good need to make. I wanted to go more space line. There such as notes on how to do these, but also procedures be very and but
Okay. And if you can test that by speaking, that'd be great.
testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. So, any questions so far? Yeah.
So what about cross-contamination between experiments? Is things kind of floating around or?
Yeah, no, things aren't floating around. And later on, I'll show you getting a bit of reverb here. one of the phones in the room.
Keep going.
So later on, I'll show you that everything had, basically there was kind of the rule of thumb was things needed to have 3 levels of containment. That was very rough, dirty, like when you're building hardware or you're thinking about how you would adapt your experiment to space or how you have to build your hardware. You needed 3 levels of containment for any liquid. And then all liquids or anything that you were planning to use for your experiment would have to be approved by NASA. And they had like a list of chemicals and other things that were pre-approved. So a lot of people like to, you know, just target those, but you know, that would take time. And that's why a lot of these experiments took years, because when you start at the beginning, you know, NASA would announce a grant, scientists would apply for it, the selection, and then they would be reviewed for various components. Science was just one of the components, science objectives, but then it was also like feasibility of like, was there hardware existing that they could use? Yes or no? Was there, how easily could it be modified into existing hardware? And these type of things. So, yeah. And then if it didn't exist already and had to be built from scratch, then also that would impact like how long it would take before you would get a flight opportunity. I hope that answers it. Okay, and so after working at Johnson Space Center, I was still actually at Johnson Space Center, but initially I was in the human research facility division, which is under life sciences. Bush announced that we were going to retire the space shuttle. Because the space station was almost completely assembled. And so we would retire the space shuttle and we would try to go back to the moon and Mars. So NASA developed this constellation program, and they would be heading up the initial steps towards, you know, making that a possibility. And I became part of a team looking at the human factors requirements and human requirements for building spacecraft and habitats for Moon and Mars missions. And that I always feel like that was part of my success in getting that job was because I had experience with all these different types of areas within NASA, because I'd worked with not only life sciences that we want to do research when we go to the moon and Mars. We want to learn more about it, but we also need to protect the humans during their travel and also during their stays there. And not only do we want to protect them, but we want them to be healthy and also able to function at their top level that they can. So that was constellation, and looking at those type of requirements, it was a big job. We had to look at radiation exposure and how to limit that and what was required in order to keep the radiation down during such long stays. We had to look at environmental parameters for inside the vehicle, what they're breathing, what are they being exposed to, waste products, how to get rid of them. Luckily, there's a lot of Apollo astronauts, or many Apollo astronauts still around, so we were able to ask them about what they had found good and bad about those missions and try to incorporate that into the future missions that we were planning on doing. So here's some photos. Back in the day when I was doing research, everyone didn't have a camera. So it's actually don't have like a million photos of myself doing research. But in this first one on the, I think it's on the left, you'll see me standing in front of a like a box, which NASA talk, we call those lockers. And inside the locker, there's a series of these canisters that you see me holding. And inside the canister is a series of tubes. So this is how you can see there's these various levels of containment, right? And so not all experiments obviously were designed the same way, but this type of system allowed for many different types of experiments to be conducted in one type of hardware. So this particular piece of hardware was interesting because it had like a three kind of stages that you could activate at various time points. So you could have it preset and turn it over to NASA to load on the space shuttle, 2 days in advance, and then of a launch. And then, it would be timed so that it could activate once it reached orbit and then terminated sometime while it was still in space. So then you had a fixed sample that you could then examine later on. Or you could potentially, start an experiment in space and then maybe give it some extra nutrients at a time point throughout. There's many different ways to get some science out of that type of system. This next photo, you'll see I've got some little cartridges that are being loaded into that rack. And then up higher is what is called as the glove box. So when we were talking about, sometimes, we did get to a point where we did want to do some mixing of things up there and have the astronauts doing that for us, because it was just the best way to do it in space. And so they designed what they call the glove box, and it allows you to put your hands in these 2 holes or ports at the side, and then you've got a visibility through the top so you can see what you're doing. But then everything is contained within that little smaller chamber. So, and these kind of lockers all get inserted into what I'm standing next to in the middle there, which is a rack. So the rack contains multiple lockers, and then the racks are all loaded into the cargo bay of the space shuttle. So different shuttle missions have different objectives, and many of them had like science objectives, and the whole cargo bay would just be full of various science, biology experiments and things like that. Some of them were to deploy the Hubble telescope, and the whole cargo bay would be full of the Hubble telescope. So various missions had various objectives. And so not all of the missions that went up had science. They all had the human component because the astronauts were going up on each of the missions. So we always had some level of science that we were collecting. And then that last picture is just me at Kennedy Space Center. I'm in the Discovery cockpit. It's in the VAB, which is the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is that massive big building that you often see a picture of at Kennedy Space Center. And it was getting refurbished for the next launch, and I got to sit in the cockpit seat, which was I never thought I'd be able to do that. Okay, this is part of my research. I was able to fly on the NASA KC-135. It's an aircraft that NASA owns that has been strengthened, and it undergoes this parabolic flight. During the flight, you get to experience zero gravity. So this is a great testing bed for your experiments before you fly them on the space shuttle. I had a great time on this. I did not vomit. It is affectionately known as the vomit comet because many people do vomit on that. And they don't really know why yet, but they haven't specifically pinpointed who will and who won't. So you kind of have to go up there and just see. And as you can see in the background, there are a few people back there. And they did, their like day is over because they're just basically vomiting the whole time. And you do about 45 of these parabolas and then back home. And this flies out of Ellington Air Force Base in Houston. So it's just basically a normal aircraft. They've strengthened it. They've gutted out most of the insides except for these seats at the back. And they've put a bunch of hooks and other things so that people can go in and set up their experiments. And you typically go down and you might run your experiment all week and make different modifications. That was a lot of fun, actually, probably a highlight.
So how long does one of those downturns last?
Oh, it provides about 30 seconds, 20 to 30 seconds of microgravity. And depending on sometimes they would run a flow where you were doing, instead of doing microgravity, you might be doing like Marshall gravity, which is a third of ours. And then the moon, or sometimes we were looking at moon, which is a third, or might be the other way around. So they could modify the level of microgravity or the G level that you experienced. But for my flights, they're all 0G. Okay, so then I was fortunate enough to be involved with the construction of the International Space Station. So this is a great, amazing feat of humanity to be able to design, build, and construct and build this in space. And it really was something that really required everyone to contribute, because no one country could really take on such a big feat. And I just think it's a great example of what humans can do if we work together. And so it's very inspiring to me, because it gives us hope for the future. This picture here, you can see at the top, the space shuttle is docked to the space station, and it's belly up to the universe. And you can also see like the Canadian arm there, which is a robotic arm that they used to help build the space station. And it also helps with maintenance of the space station from the outside. Various things have to be replaced, or different cargo vehicles might bring cargo to the space station. The Canadian arm, you will capture those and then, gently bring it in and dock it to the space station. And yeah, it's up there now. It's been up there for 25 years, and it's like a national laboratory and there's a lot of research that's being done there over the last 25 years. The size of it, to get an idea, it's actually the size of a football field. And it's about the areas that the astronauts live in are these like canister type cylindrical canisters. That's where they live. And then, of course, the solar panels are there for powering. And then there's a lot of ports. You can have up to 8 different vehicles kind of docked to the space station at any one time. Here's some pictures of some of the training done by the astronauts. I was responsible for training the astronauts for use of the ultrasound up on the space station. And it was the only really imaging piece of equipment on space station. And so we would always get every expedition crew that went up, we would train them on how to use it. And that allowed us to test it, because if we did need it for an emergency, then the crew members would know how to use it, and we could get some images back on Earth that we could use for diagnoses. Because astronauts do have a number of different conditions. Gallstones is one that is commonly occurring up in space, and it would be good to get some information and make some decisions on, if you can triage it while you're up there, or if it's of such a severity, you need to, end the mission early and bring crews home. I also got to train John Glenn. He flew in 1998 on a space shuttle mission, and he carries the record as the oldest astronaut ever to fly. So that was a real privilege, since he was, he's basically an American icon, and it was really a good experience to work with him. This picture on the left, on the right there, of these 2 astronauts doing the ultrasound, that's on space station. And as you can see, it's kind of a cluttered environment. There's a lot of kind of tubes and switches, etc. But this is one of the experiments I worked on, and we were able to, after the Columbia incident, when shuttles weren't flying anymore, we had kind of a bit of a down impact to the science research we could do, because we couldn't send up consumables or anything else that we needed to do our experiments. So we managed to be able to get a CD-ROM with some software sent up through the Russians, and some gel. And that was like, it doesn't sound like much, but that is a lot of work to try and get something like that sent up there. And we were able to do a bunch of science. We were able to teach the astronauts how to do some basic ultrasonic imaging. And we had people like sonographers in mission control who were instructing them on how to move the probe, how to capture the images, and so they could be useful diagnostically on the ground. And this has real implications for remote communities here on Earth, because not every community has access to these expert sonographers, but we have shown through here that with limited training, you can actually get diagnostic level images. So that has actually been a very useful feedback to things we do here. On this note, I'd like to show a small video that is hopefully gives you a bit of a feel for what it's like to be in space, and shows you astronauts working and living on the space station. Hi. That's the Soyuz rocket. It's launching from Kazakhstan. They're the Auroras. That's a cargo vehicle bringing supplies to the space station. And this is bringing crew up to the space station. 93 million miles from the sun. They have 16 sunsets every day. So they do a full rotation of the Earth every 90 minutes. That's RoboNaut. It's the robot. They have to test out various robotic functions. That's washing hair in space for the astronauts. They have a lot of exercise, about 2 hours a day, and this is to help with bone density and muscle mass. Science experiments. They're those solar panels, and you can actually see the space station orbiting the Earth. That's their crew quarters, their little private sleep quarters, and that's the only private space that each astronaut has for themselves on space station. 240,000 miles from the come a long way to belong here. To share this view the night, it won't breeze tonight. Over the horizon, into the bright sky. It's international, so you have Russians, Canadians, Japanese astronaut there, and that's all their words behind. That's the cupola. That's where a lot of the pictures get taken of the Earth. They use that for science to look at images and how things are changing. The astronauts love spending time in that because they get to look at the Earth. That's the -80 freezer that we have. They took samples so they come back. There's some astronauts doing an EVA, extra or spacewalk. Every road is a slippery when the shuttle program, before SpaceX started bringing astronauts up and back, we went up and down through the Russian space agency, and they would come back in the Soyuz. So it's kind of a hard landing. The parachute slows them down, and then the rockets stopping the landing at the end. Here's an astronaut watching his son's hockey game. So they have internet access. They try to make them as comfortable as they can while they're up there. This is the rescue team coming out in Kazakhstan in the middle of nowhere to pick up the astronauts and bring them back. That's water in space. The surface tension just keeps it all in balls like that. People get ready, here it comes, it's a light, a beautiful light, over the horizon into our eyes. Okay. So that's it. That's the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and if anyone has questions.
Do you have any idea now what the cooperative relationship is with Russia?
Well, I think Oh, sure. Okay, the question was, do I have any idea of the cooperative agreement with the other international partners are at the moment? And well, no, I don't have the inside on that. But from what I know of friends of mine who still work there, is that they, they're trying to carry on as they have in the past and keep separate. Politics does play a big role, as you know, on these are government agencies. So, yeah. Yes.
I worked in the research department at Oscar Mayer. One of my projects was developing meat with the astronauts, with the Woods Hole scientist from Massachusetts. Did you work at all with food or cover any what they eat out there and so on?
Okay, so the question is from a gentleman in the audience who used to work at Oscar Mayer developing food. Did I work in the food department? I did not work with the food department. I have visited them because some of the science experiments were looking at nutritional value, etc., of the foods. So we did have some input from the experiments. So we would give input to the food lab as to what we needed from the research, but I did not, participate in development of foods and that type of thing. The food has come a long way since the Apollo days. One of my girlfriends is actually an astronaut now. We used to work together, and now she's an astronaut. And she said, they've got a really good selection of foods, and they're very tasty, and yeah, it's pretty good actually now, which is very different from the Apollo days. Yes.
Yeah, and I know that you're really careful about any microbial contamination getting up there, but you think with all these people up there for 25 years, there'd be like stuff coming out of people that would kind of contaminate the atmosphere. Is there a way they work on trying to clean up any junk that gets up there? Or? Yes.
Okay. So there's a question about the the keeping the space station clean and bringing up stuff from Earth. And when I was talking about planetary protection, that's a different type of program. That's a program that's looking at sending like the rovers to Mars, or like satellites to explore the solar system. Those ones we were making sure there were no microbes and really trying to do the best we could to not take anything from Earth with us. For the space station, it's a little bit different, and for also shuttle. So the astronauts, when they come for a mission, they go into quarantine prior to being launched. And during that quarantine period, it's quite strict as to who they can interface with, etc. And they're living at Kennedy Space Center, for instance, during the shuttle years. There's an area at NASA, at Kennedy Space Center, where they live. All their meals are prepared and all this type of thing. So yeah, they are taking up what they have, but there are steps in place to make sure no one's going up sick. And things like that. But it does get dirty up there. A lot of the time, the astronauts are doing a lot of housekeeping duties during their, like, a standard time frame is 6 months when they go to live up there. So a lot of it is like, doing things like cleaning filters and, making sure making sure you're leaving it as best you can for the next group that are coming up, because you don't want to be known as the ones that, left it really messy, because word gets out. No. So, and as I tell younger children that I give talks to, these are the skills, your parents teach you, to be nice and respect others, and, make sure you keep it in a good order so that others who you're sharing the equipment with and the space with, have it the way, that it was left and that type of thing. So it's not a big issue, and there's systems in place also designed into the function of the space station to try and keep it as in good order as possible. Yes.
What are some of the most important things that you've discovered in the experiments that you've done?
Me personally, or
Yeah, I do.
Me.
It's not so clear to me exactly what your research is.
Yes, okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay, well, my research that I did, which was at the beginning when I was at K-State in the gravitational biology grant, I looked at mainly two areas. I looked at gap junction proteins and how they communicate. So I'm a biochemist, so I purified these proteins out of tissues, and then I reconstituted these particular type of proteins into liposomes. And then I looked at how different dyes were transferred between liposomes through these cardiac gap junction proteins. And so right at the beginning, for instance, that experiment that I was doing, I was looking to see, is the cell communication that's happening between these proteins that are in liposomes, are they communicating in the same way as they are on Earth? And one of the things that we know about space is that things as simple as like convection currents, etc. So, and fluids mixing are very different because the different fluids have different densities and gravity affects that. So the mixing that you see that happens on Earth is very different to mixing that happens without that vector of 1G. And so these were some of the questions that we were looking at and trying to get more information on. Another experiment, the other experiment that I did was one where I looked at pre-embryonic heart cells and how they developed into heart cells during a microgravity exposure. So I compared I compared cells that were going to develop into heart cells on the ground and in flight, and I found that the ones in flight developed at a slower rate, which kind of goes into heart cells. So there was less myofibrils in them. And that was probably because my theory was that was because without the G vector, they had less strain on them. And with the less strain, they were needing less muscle fibers than the ones in space. And there's been a bunch of other experiments that were done on like immune cells to see if they function as well in space. I mean, the list is on and on, but those were my two areas that I looked at when I was a researcher. And then after that period, I was really basically coordinating and assisting other scientists with their experiments. And that list is a long list because it was many decades of working with them. Yes.
Can you discuss what you see in astronauts that have spent 6 months in the International Space Station with the microgravity and radiation exposure? And
okay. Yeah, so the question is, can I explain what we see in astronauts who have spent 6 months in microgravity, like for instance, on a space station mission? And so what we know happens is that their muscle degrades, like their muscle mass will be reduced. And that's merely because your body is doing a lot of work when we're at 1G. Just even me standing up here, my muscles are working to keep me upright. They're pushing and working against the 1G vector. So we know muscle mass. Bone density also is affected by these kind of forces that are absent in space. There's a bunch of fluid shifts that happen because at 1G and in our evolution, our heart has developed so that it's pumping the fluid around our body and it's having to pump and work against gravity. Up there, it doesn't need to do that. So the heart actually, will get smaller because it has to do less work. And then, so when they return, there are some issues with not having, the heart has to build back up again, which they do. So what we've, and there's a range of other issues too with fluid shifts and other things that happen. And over the years, from when I started to now we know all these things happen, and we've done a number of what we call countermeasure programs and studies where we know, for instance, that by having the astronauts exercise for 2 hours a day, that will actually, a lot of astronauts come back with more muscle mass now than they used to, and density, bone density is maintained, and these type of things. So we've worked out systems, we've designed exercise equipment that they use now, and it allows them to get those necessary kind of stimulus to keep their bodies strong. There's changes in the eye as well. Radiation can affect some of their eyes. Their eyeball, I've heard, it actually changes shape. They often come back and they're a little bit taller because there's less compression on their spines during space flight. So there's a lot of things that we've learned, and I'm sure there's a lot more to learn, but we do know now, like at the beginning, it wasn't clear how we would survive it for 6 months, and if we could, and what we would be like when we returned. So now we've people take for granted, but it's like decades of research and working to get these systems in place. And yeah, so we've really come a long way. Yes.
Here's a question. How does a zero gravity bathroom work?
With vacuum. Okay, the question was, how does the zero gravity bathroom work? Yeah, with suction. So they have basically, it's almost like a funnel and a tube, and it's a bit more challenging for women, I've heard, than men because of our physiology, our anatomy, I should say. And but there's suction. So because there's no gravity like to pull the urine or whatever, the waste away, there's a slight suction so that it gives direction to whatever's, but it's challenging, and it takes a lot of practice, I've heard, and you know, there are accidents. Yeah.
Do you have a mini septic system up there then, or what?
I don't know exactly how that is.
Space?
Yes, the solids are put into with all the other waste, and then they are put into these. A lot of the cargo vehicles that come up do not return to Earth, so they get filled. The cargo comes out, they get filled with the waste, and then they get deployed off the space station, and as they come to re-entry, they burn up and got rid of the urine. Well, what they say is yesterday's coffee is today's coffee. So yes.
Do they recycle urine into drinking water?
Yeah.
How do they do that?
I don't know exactly. No, they have a bunch of like filters and other, I don't know exactly how they do it, but they've been doing that for a pretty long time. And, you know, that's ultimately the goal, is to have like a closed loop on these things, so that there is kind of like zero waste, and you can utilize any waste into something that can be used for, you know, the plants. Any waste products, you know, can go for fertilizer, or for the CO2 can be used. And because, you know, for these long duration missions, we do need food. We can't take all the food and water that we need. So we have to come up with ways of doing that. And I know recently they actually growing plants, lettuce up there, that they can harvest it, and they're getting some meals from this lettuce that they're growing up on space station. So still got a ways to go, you know, because we can't survive on lettuce, but you know, and the moon, you know, water. This is why we need to find out more about the planets in the other areas that we're going to go and visit, to see what we have to take and what we can get from the natural environment that's there. Any other questions?
Carbon dioxide,
Carbon dioxide. Yes.
how do they deal with that?
Well, they have, how do they deal with carbon dioxide? They have scrubbers up there that get rid of the carbon dioxide. I have read that it's not a great system. There's room for improvement for that because often it'll build up inside the capsules or inside space station. And so there's, they still have to work on that, I think, to improve it. There's other toxins that anything that gets sent up into these closed environments like this, they do a lot of testing with them beforehand, because you can't have something off-gassing into a closed system that could end up being toxic. So that is why they're so strict on all the materials. Anything that gets sent up has to undergo certain testing to make sure it's not going to contribute to or create a toxic environment to the gases up there. But I don't know enough about that, sorry.
I was just curious if that biosphere down in Arizona.
Oh, yeah.
If they did any work there that was helpful to the space effort.
I don't know, but I remember that the biosphere projects, and they still have those, and they're good models. I'm sure there is a lot of lessons learned from that, especially since the idea behind that was this closed system that could support humans living in there for a long duration. It also provides a good case for the isolation that. But I don't know specifically what might have been taken from those studies and transferred. There's a lot of other models too, like there's some underwater models and, bed rest studies, and there's a lot of different ones out there. Yeah. Yes.
Can you discuss at all the experiments or studies that have been done for radiation exposures?
That I don't, sorry, radiation exposure experiments, I don't know a lot about that. They do have monitors that they wear to track that. And I know there is more interest in that with the eyes and eyesight as we are getting into these longer duration missions. But I don't know a lot about that. Sorry.
Another question. Let's see if anybody's asking on chat. All right, Elizabeth Wright says,
Oh.
wonderful, Jackie, thank you for sharing. Thank
That's
you,
my boss.
Elizabeth, for hanging in there with the one
Current boss.
technical difficulty after other. Okay, any other questions then? If not, thank you very much. So I talked to Kay, and I think what I'm gonna do is buy a new portable one as a backup for this. This one has good